Okay, so we're on the topic of liberalism, inspired by Michael Frieden's book, Liberalism, A Very Short Introduction. This approach to political philosophy is defined by dynamic and actionable motives that have norms and values that show a pattern. This is in contrast to conservatism, which is often stagnant. It is a worldview that tries to provide the most utility for the individual and society as a whole. It seeks to find standards that everyone should respect and adhere to and measure how government practices and other societal constraints hinder pursuits of life, liberty, and happiness. Again, liberals differ based on their location in space and time, but these differences are minute compared to the grand scale of thinking that has progressed to form the similarities of thought. There are numerous values that are spread across all liberal thinkers, such as individuality or justice, and every person who adheres to the ideology places a quantifiable value on each spectrum for each value. Potential for self-fulfillment and self-development is an example of value of the liberal, and the amount of emphasis on such could be higher than the value of societal collectivism. And in like fashion, emphasis on a free market may be more important to some than others. Also, as circumstances and scenarios change and appear, these values set may adjust accordingly. And there is, of course, no objective correct approach to liberalism, as it has been a constant theme that politics and political thought live in a subjective realm throughout this book. Political parties that adhere to codes of liberal ideology are not the same as the liberal principle of thinking and often differ from liberal practices in that they are machines for winning power. It is left to the individual intellectual propensity of the politician to adopt liberal methods for governing, and public opinion often is manipulated with a misinformed perception of what it means to be liberal, creating misinformed politicians. Political parties fail to understand political philosophy and rather take a more pragmatic approach in that they administratively adopt political views and designate political officials. They must simplify their beliefs, the parties, and therefore cannot adopt grand views or implement large-scale scholarly activities. This is a problem for liberalism because if the parties were able to divulge their views as they clearly see them, then they would almost always adopt a liberal standpoint. In most nations, liberal is in the name of the political party, but in today's reality in the United States, liberals are very likely associated with and part of the Democratic Party. It is important then for liberal-minded people to view their philosophy of one of a historical creation developing and adapting over time. This is in line with many progressive views, such as those that emanate from the Democratic Party in the modern era, which has come to encapsulate a mix of conservative, liberal, and socialist views, with liberalism dominating. Progressives would see a flow and adaptation to new problems and solutions through a prism of openness to change. Liberalism in itself is a philosophy that adopts changes as they arrive. Throughout time, liberals have been cautious about democracy since its conception. They are not unlike the rest of the world in that they too understand that a majority of individuals left to pure democracy can oppress a minority. However, liberals understand that their philosophy has to exist in the shadows of a political or governmental system, and that democracy, driven by the voice of the people, is the best form of society. As mentioned, there is a large discrepancy between collectivist liberals and more individually inclined personas, so the wheels of liberal discourse continue to turn. All citizens insist that if they can improve themselves, then society can improve itself. So, in a sense, liberals are categorically similar in their pursuit of a utopian society. Neoliberalism argues that the community is a form of living interpretation of life, meaning that it is a form of organically developing institution. Society is like a nematode that moves based on its environment. However, this nematode must interact with other nematodes and be capable of higher faculties of the mind in a way that produces the most benefits for the liberal nematode. A nematode is a worm, and this worm seeks what is good. Neoliberals and progressives urge activism in seeking this good and use democracy as a means for holding the government accountable. While doing so, they place a high emphasis on exploring the transfer of ideas from scholarly work to actual boots on the ground politics and seek a link between the individual and societal betterment, a step further than many conservatives who tend to stop at the individual. In the United States, capitalism is extremely prevalent, and liberals have no other option but to address the concerns of socialism, that big business is stealing livelihoods, but they often do this through the same means as they keep the government accountable, through the use of democratic endeavors. On the other side, dealing with a welfare state is of concern to the modern liberal, and although they often put the highest value on social justice and civil rights of any philosophy, they understand the problems associated with the welfare state. It is propaganda and a misconstrued notion of the empathetic nature of the liberal that arrives at the idea that liberals want a so-called welfare state. Liberals support the government rather emphatically, but in no shape want the dissolution of a free market, typically. It is the progression of the problems of humanity that continues to develop these different views of liberalism. Going back, it is important to view liberalism as having layers that developed over time that interact with each other in the modern period. Sometimes these layers do not mend coherently, and there becomes a separation in order to emphasize one layer over others, and other times they are equally recognized. Not to mention changes in technology and cultural progress have created the need to manipulate these layers in a flexible manner to fit the current scenarios of political deliberations. It is important for the politician to understand that liberalism is viewed in the modern day, but also must be observed in times past, and how it fits at certain points throughout history and its creation of the modern day. There can be more layers, of course, but it is these critical layers that truly define the liberal landscape and mindset. The most critical layer of liberalism is that of the freedom of rights is that of freedom that rights provide liberty protected by those rights. These rights are similar to and include natural rights, such as freedom from fear and freedom to express oneself. However, liberty must have some constraints so as not to infringe on the liberty of others. Another layer developed later is that rather than trying to manipulate the community of individuals to form unified purposes, an emphasis on the individual for self-improvement is put into place. This includes further development of the mind, body, and soul through the possession of goods and services, which develop the economic outlook of the liberal. Being able to own things and trade allowed for the interchange of goods and the movement of people freely. Unrestrained economic trade and self-improvement initiatives allowed for supply and demand to both increase and create the likes of mass manufacturers, banking, and mercantilist trade agreements. Hence, liberty became intertwined with economic freedom. A further layer of liberalism can be placed on the development of the individual with their rights to intellectual prosperity, enlightenment, and the scholarly activity that dwells so deeply in the minds of individuals became open to new cultures, new values, and the understanding that humanity would continue to improve and enlarge both spiritually and technologically. And then another layer developed, a layer of support for others and an emphasis on the importance of relationships between members of a society. An understanding was held that many in society could not exist or survive without help from others, and it is the obligation of society to help those in need. If not spiritual, the golden rule was still upheld. Treat others as the self would want to be treated, and all will benefit. This is where our societal nematode is created. Societies and civilizations exist to navigate through space and time by helping the slowest of the components of the nematode, which in turn will help others when the time comes, all propelling the societal nematode forward. And then a final layer can be added if the layers are to be limited, which oversteps the previous layers and suggests that because the world is in a state of anarchy, with groups vying against groups or nematodes vying against nematodes, foreign versus domestic exchanges have to be viewed and supported on a globalizing basis. This means that identifying the identities of various cultures and localities is of the utmost importance, celebrating both similarities and differences. The theory that liberalism holds between the government and the people is one that is not as simplified as in conservatism or socialism. There is no strict sense of localizing or privatizing the government over a large federal bureaucracy, nor are there any not so novel ideas of the poor overthrowing the elite. And further, many of the values held by liberalism are stolen by the other philosophies. But liberalism has historical patterns, and these patterns are more observable in liberalism than in the other ideologies. A progressive pursuit that seeks a methodology of past learning for societal organization. So what are the main components or accentuating features of liberalism? The first is that many aspects of the layers previously discussed can be attributed to liberalism, such as support for a free market and individual liberty, while maintaining a supportive balance for those in need. Meaning all the core beliefs of liberalism extend from the primary philosophy, and the weight each adherent places on each of these layers defines their core beliefs. Conservatives and liberals alike place emphasis on a stable society, and liberals and socialists both emphasize helping the most disenfranchised of individuals. However, liberals differ in their methods for attaining such a stable society and helping poor citizens. The difference is that which was previously discussed, a progressive and future-oriented approach to dealing with modern problems rather than traditional and creative approaches to justice and charity. Without getting too deep into the philosophical meaning of liberty, which is the highest pursuit of liberals across the board, whether they are consciously aware of it or not, liberalism is the liberty of acceptance on the outward and individual rights on the inward, a balancing of introversion and extroversion. Rational thought is another pursuit that maintains that intelligible and respectful policy must be implemented in government to best steer the bodies of society to prosperity. There are other concepts that pertain to giving a definition to liberalism, such as progress, love for thy neighbor, and undoubtedly inclusivity for all cultures and ethnicities. However, a primary concern or concept consumed and inherited by liberals is power. Pure governmental federal power that so many conservatives fear, but liberals embrace, an empire state of mind which is able to protect, steer, and assume responsibility for the traits and wants of a society and the people at large. The moving and shaking of the nation and the necessary checks and balances, the enforceable usages of power, as well as its dispersal, all come from the powerful body of suits and ties that create the proud political body of the government itself. Liberals often attach smaller concepts to the meaning of their philosophy as well. Property, production, and the rule of law are some of these examples. These outside concepts are inherent in maintaining ownership rights and creating paths for economic prosperity, essential in the United States and around the world. Another example is immigration. The whole of liberals have usually been open to the prospects of immigration to their place of habitation and open with welcome arms, those of other origins with a sense of optimism and benefit of the doubt. They appreciate all the benefits of a diverse culture, the production that human capital can bring, and contribution in the forms of skills and knowledge. Liberals, knowledgeable ones, understand the benefits that competition brings, both between businesses and states and even national governments or any other group or entity competing with others. And they love and are beloved by nonprofit organizations. The possibilities of liberalism through their impetus for individual rights, social justice, and want, using the layers of rule of law, free markets, individuality, welfare, and respect for all peoples interchangeably, are unlimited and continue to evolve in the modern day. Liberals, as mentioned, are the predominant force behind the bureaucracy and would see expansions and interference by the government to a degree that propels the United States further in a similar respect as other more nationalized governments, a propensity for more spending and bigger government to lead the United States ahead in the race consumed by globalization, where the United States is at threat to be left behind in traditional values of complacency and irreversible cowardice, rather than their divine destiny to embrace technological advancement in the changing of times, meeting government competition head on. Okay, so all of that was part 2. That was the Alex Green Handbook part 2. Now we are on to the Alex Green Handbook part 3, which is solely about the Constitution. And it's about 80 pages, I think. And I will quote the Constitution a lot, and all this information comes from the National Constitution Center. It's in my own words, but I have to go through and make sure it's not plagiarized. So Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution reads, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. The Constitution states, all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives, so establishing the legislative branch of the United States government. At the heart of this social compact between the people of the United States and the government in its establishing representatives to join in foreign legislation. There are many fundamental components to the United States Congress. The most fundamental component is that of bicameralism, a legislative feature that helps to govern the states and people more efficiently. The Constitution founds a bicameral Congress in order to protect individual liberties, and this is done through 2 distinct strategies. One is the establishment of the House, which is more responsive to the whims of the people, the other being the establishment of a Senate, to protect the nation from the whims of the people. Another fundamental component is the limited and enumerated powers outlined in the Constitution. The legislative powers herein granted limit Congress to powers only as prescribed in the Constitution. It enumerates Congress to have specific and vast powers in contrast. One early debate was whether Congress could establish a national bank. This controversy is a prime example of the limiting versus enumerating powers of the Constitution. Expansive interpretation can contextualize these limitations and enumerations, and much of the power of Congress happens to be at the discretion of the interpretation of the Constitution. This is typically done through the court system. On a side note, non-delegation is fundamental to the Constitution. This is the idea that every bit of legislation comes from Congress rather than the President or the Supreme Court. The idea, a form of separation of powers, has even led to a principle of non-delegation in which Congress lacks the authority to delegate legislative power to the other branches of government. Much of the Supreme Court's delineation has rested on the idea that Congress cannot delegate legislative power. However, this is not always the case in practice, and much delegation has been given by Congress. This delegation, though, is always accompanied by intelligible and discerning principles that guide the authority to be delegated. Since the New Deal, Much delegation has taken place, and many executive and judicial branch officials have become empowered by Congress. Many justices have said that the court does not have a say in whether delegation or non-delegation is the true intention of the Constitution, and it can be seen that delegation at certain times has both positive and negative implications, but undoubtedly helps the day-to-day function of the United States government. In summary, the Supreme Court, in its ruling, once stated, "We expect Congress to speak clearly if it wishes to assign to an agency decisions of vast economic and political significance." The argument of delegation, as opposed to non-delegation, quickly becomes apparent when observing the vesting clause. All legislative power herein granted, Congress is the ultimate lawmaking body in the United States, and its ability to delegate power must be limited. The vesting clause could be considered ambiguous, and one might read Article 1, Section 1 to mean that delegation of power is prohibited. And an interpretation in this light would be considered a broad reading of the Constitution, whereas the power to pass statutes would be a narrow interpretation. However, it is possible to explain the vesting clause as giving Congress the power to delegate to other officials lawmaking authority. Okay, so the vesting clause could be considered ambiguous, and one might read Article 1, Section 1 to mean that delegation of power is prohibited. An interpretation in this light would be considered a broad reading of the Constitution, whereas the power to pass statutes would be a narrower interpretation. However, it is possible to explain the vesting clause as giving Congress the power to delegate to other officials lawmaking authority. It comes to the forefront over time that Congress has the discretion to enable federal officials with powers which the legislature might rightfully exercise itself. In the previous century, for example, the Supreme Court has stated that Congress can delegate to federal officials lawmaking authority if Congress laid down by legislative act an intelligible principle to which the person or body authorized to act is directed to conform. As previously stated, there has not been, in the past 80 years, any instance where the Supreme Court has chosen to observe a non-delegation doctrine, a principle of intelligible limits, has been applied leniently or considered unreviewable. There's absolutely no non-delegation doctrine that can be enforced, and opposite to this, a delegation authorizing doctrine has been adopted, meaning Congress has the ability to delegate legislative power. There are, of course, negative consequences for not enforcing a non-delegation attitude, such as a reduction in democratic accountability and difficult, controversial questions being raised. These concerns are, however, managed by a right of delegation. One expression of this is that legislative power is vested in Congress, and minor legislative authority by Congress is subject to limitations. Therefore, it is rare to find authority of lawmaking by judges. Rather, delegation must be explicitly implemented by the legislative branch, thus also making the delegation authority subject to limitations by the legislative branch's provisions and statutes. The Supreme Court's deference to the foundational conceptualization of the delegation doctrine becomes apparent when the courts defer to federal agency interpretation in case of discrepancy in statute mandates. The delegation doctrine has been reviewed by the Supreme Court, in which, pursuant to delegated lawmaking authority, the court insisted that notice and comment procedures must be followed by the legislature according to the Administrative Procedure Act. And there have been rulings on quasi-legislative statutory interpretation canons that prevent agencies from exceeding large policy changes authorized by Congress. One example of such a canon is the Major Questions Canon. This implements the idea that although Congress has delegated legislative power, that does not give rights to change major societal and economic policy. It must be explicit in its delegation that Congress intends to have extreme societal or economic controversies settled or amended. This canon also provides for significant limitations on lawmaking by federal agencies, even if it is consistent with processes of Congress. Unfortunately, there is a strong concern that the Major Questions Canon cannot possibly be equally standardized by the court system. These canons of statutory interpretation are the judicial branch's best method for deterring major policy swaying, not a non-delegation doctrine. On the contrary, proponents of a non-delegation doctrine argue that it is precisely included in the Constitution. They argue that although the Supreme Court has a notion for allowing delegation and Congress continues to authorize such, legislative power should not and cannot be delegated to individual congresspeople, private citizens, or other branches of the United States government. Indeed, since being central to a Republican form of government, the non-delegation doctrine is persistent. Lawmaking power is placed in a representative legislature in accordance with the Constitution. The Founding Fathers understood that placing a vast amount of legislative power into a body of men rather than a single individual was undoubtedly best. A small group or individual was seen to be inferior to a lawmaking body, thanks to the intelligent principles of John Locke, the English philosopher. And as an aside, there were many reasons for enumerating and delegating powers to a bicameral Congress. Consent of the people was the first and foremost reason, and that the representatives would be those of the people themselves. Secondly, through controversy and debate, a strong legislative procedure would come into being. A collective legislature would also provide for fewer nuances of small and specialized factions. Although not perfect, collective legislation would promise to safeguard constitutional principles. An important principle as such is that the centrality of representative government would impose constitutional limitations on delegating power to the executive branch. There is not a single line in the Constitution that explicitly grants Congress the ability to delegate power, and the Supreme Court has upheld this by issuing verdicts on the grounds of non-delegation. It has been stated that in every case in which the question has been raised, the Court has recognized that there are limits of delegation which there is no constitutional authority to transcend. The non-delegation doctrine is imperative in structurally and textually limiting federal government overreach. Congress's limited and enumerated powers are designed to promote individual liberty within the confines of governmental power. A non-delegation practice designates these limitations. There would be a severe lack of limitations in the case of delegation because federal agencies could and would continue to expand their already substantial power. They would forgo the processes included in bicameralism and presentment. Furthermore, non-delegation enforces a separation of powers, and open powers to delegate authority prevent limitations, due process, and accountability. Legislative powers cannot, in good faith, be combined with executive and adjudicational powers. There has, however, and especially since the New Deal, been an increased notion that delegation of power is permissible. Therefore, non-delegation exists primarily in the breach, meaning that an identifiable unconstitutional delegation is difficult to define, and transference of federal power by Congress has continued. The executive branch may execute the laws of the nation, but they lack lawmaking authority. Justice Black of the Supreme Court previously explained, the president's power to see that laws are faithfully executed refutes the idea that he is to be a lawmaker, and the Constitution is neither silent nor equivocal about who shall make laws which the president is to execute. The difficulty lies in determining when the executive is operating under direct statutes and when it is legislating of its own right. The Supreme Court has disregarded a non-delegation principle for reasons of competition between Congress and the President. Justice Scalia of the Court stated Congress could delegate lawmaking authority only at the expense of increasing the power of either the President or the courts. Thus, the need for delegation would have to be important enough to induce Congress to aggrandize its primary competitor for political power. The reasons for delegating power to the President, a political rival, vary. The increased polarization of the political spectrum, in addition to the avoidance of responsibility for making choices, are the primary of such. There is also the possibility of collusion between federal agencies and members of Congress, and that delegation would allow for more authority in the congressional domain. In summary, a lack of competition between the legislature and the executive inhibits the structural check on Congress's power. This also applies in the other direction, where Congress as an institution has been weakened by delegation to the executive. Overseeing of the executive branch by Congress is disabled since the executive possesses structural advantages for speedy action. There have been a few judges who have openly argued for further enforcement of a non-delegation doctrine. A single example is Justice Thomas, who argues that failure to enforce such costs undermines our constitutional protections of individual liberty. Non-delegation cannot rest purely on the reliance of judicial review. The Constitution provides for Congress in the form of a Republican governmental form that does not morph well with the current administrative state of the nation. Article 1, Section 2 states the House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year by the people of the several states, and the electors in each state shall have the qualifications requisite for electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. No person shall be a representative who shall not have attained to the age of 25 years and been 7 years a citizen of the United States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state in which he shall be chosen. Representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states, which may be included with this union, according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians not taxed, 3/5 of all persons. The actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States, and with every subsequent term of 10 years in such manner as they shall by law direct. The number of representatives shall not exceed 1 for every 30,000, but each state shall have at least one representative, and until such enumeration shall be made, the state of New Hampshire shall be entitled to choose 3, Massachusetts 8, Rhode Island and Providence Plantations 1, Connecticut 5, New York 6, New Jersey 4, Pennsylvania 8, Delaware 1, Maryland 6, Virginia 10, North Carolina 5, South Carolina 5, and Georgia 3. When vacancies happen in the representation from any state, the executive authority thereof shall issue writs of election to fill such vacancies. The House of Representatives shall choose their speaker and all their officers and shall have the sole power of impeachment. So, there is not a single element of the Constitution that exemplifies the revolutionary capabilities of the document as much as its establishment of the House of Representatives. Its direct provision of electing House members by the people of the several states is nothing short of legendary, even if lacking in its originality and implementation. However, in the period when the Articles of Confederation reigned supreme, state legislatures had the discretion of electing delegates. Confederation delegates were chosen as such by all except 2 states. Of the founding fathers, James Madison and James Wilson are credited with decisively arguing for the imposition of direct elections by the people for the members of the House of Representatives. This allowed for a grand connection between the general populace and the legislative branch of government and was a de facto departure from recognizing elected officials by state legislative majority. Unfortunately, much of this populace was deprived of voting rights upon ratification, namely African Americans, Native Americans, and women, and there were numerous attempts to make voting rights difficult for white men as well, including qualification via property ownership. In all, approximately 2/3 of white men were given the right to vote, and the rest of the populace was left for naught. Regardless, proper democracy was achieved by milestones such as representation by the people. The United States government elections were more accessible than those under English law at the time of the Constitution's ratification, and the states moved rapidly toward universal suffrage, albeit for white men. Again, disgracefully, the Constitution existed nearly a century before people of African descent had their deserved suffrage. Like qualifications for becoming a member of the House of Representatives are a staple of Article 1, Section 2. There are 3 qualifications: being 25 years of age, having been a citizen for at least 7 years, and being an inhabitant of whichever state he or she is elected from. These qualifications were less severe in comparison to qualifications for most state legislatures. One aspect of the House of Representatives is that elections must take place every 2 years, which is in stark contrast to that of the Senate, as explained later. Since the representatives of the House are directly elected by the people, this has led to the upholding by the Supreme Court that election districts be precisely divided based on population. Typically, state legislative districts, have an error standard of 10%, whereas the Supreme Court has provision that United States House districts can be deemed unconstitutional in error as little as 1%. There is an actual enumeration of the people every 10 years, which guides redistricting practices and procedures. Today, this is performed by the United States Census Bureau. Unfortunately, slaves were held to be considered 3/5 of a vote as of the ratification of the Constitution, and this was later amended properly. A state's representation in the United States House of Representatives is also representative of their representation in the Electoral College, established under a later article. Article 1, Section 2 also gives the House of Representatives the sole power of impeachment, including that of the President. Despite the Constitutional Convention arguing heavily over the content of Article 1, Section 2 for many years afterward, it was one of the least debated components of the Constitution. Recently, however, much public attention has been focused on disproportionate congressional districting, and although the Supreme Court has long held there is no judicial solution to this political question of malapportionment, it is still the subject of calls for judicial review. The court has held the principle of one person, one vote as a constitutional standard for decades. James Wilson, a founding father, is quoted by the Supreme Court as describing this representation as when a given number of citizens in one part of the state chooses as many representatives as are chosen by the same number of citizens in any other part of the state. Thus, the Supreme Court now holds congressional districting to a mathematically precise process. The public of the United States graciously accepted and accepts the one person, one vote conceptualization, but though it may be simplistic, many controversies have been observed regarding such a principle, some of which have yet to be settled. Many of its decisions handed down by the Supreme Court have used words such as population, citizens, and voters without definitive differentiation. The issue is that it is in rare circumstances that a district's voting population equals its total population. The Supreme Court has used terminology to describe districting in terms of votes rather than population, but districting has in fact been based on the principle of population equality. Hence, votes are not weighted as or held to an equalized commonality. One of the most prominent Supreme Court cases in regard to this issue was in Texas. The Supreme Court held that although the voter population varied among districts, districts were deemed constitutional as a result of the total population being equalized. Even as this case is historically justifiable and upholding of tradition, there is an argument to be made that the decision was erroneous. In the Texas case, they asked the court to permit either total population or voting power, and even possibly registered voting power, to be categorically justified as redistricting standards. The court limited its decision in saying that districting based upon equal population was the only acceptable practice. Legislatures throughout the nation continue to pursue alternatives in redistricting practicalities, and to many it seems that in time legal requirements regarding such will be modified. It may be appropriate to change the appropriation for districting, given that the Constitution prescribes state legislatures with the determination of redistricting. Largely unrelated to redistricting controversy brought upon by Article 1, Section 2, but still relevant in the House of Representatives' role in impeachment of the president, the debatable text at hand lies in a later article. Although Article 1, Section 2 grants the right and outlines the criteria for impeachment, what constitutes high crimes and misdemeanors is the subject of such controversy. It is mostly resolved, though, that the House of Representatives decides largely what constitutes such, depending on the place and time of such criminal activity. A major key component of Article 1, Section 2 lies in the expansion of the right to vote and is exemplified in relation to constitutional interpretation. Being only a facet of constitutional subject had been changed with time. The majority of enforcement of political and civil liberties has moved from state propagation to that of the federal government, and therefore civil liberties have been amended into the Constitution on multiple occasions, vastly more than any other principle of humanity. Inclusivity, as it relates to the United States democracy, has gone through much litigation and barriers, but has been found to be a cornerstone of the nation. The one person, one vote principle, upheld by the Supreme Court, as well as the Voting Rights Act, are such examples of proper enabling of voting. We no longer recognize the discrimination that was long implemented regarding the right to vote. This century, however, new concerns have been brought to light in relation to the importance of Article 1, Section 2. There are two different controversies that have been shed upon the United States, both of which are in regard to the Hispanic population's increase in their right to vote and how it relates to that of districting. There has yet to be a significant resolution for either by the Supreme Court. The issue arises with renewed focus on state registration to vote. An example of this can be seen in Arizona, where the Hispanic population has increased drastically. Arizona mandated documented proof of being a citizen in order to vote. This is in direct opposition to the National Voter Registration Act, where states must accept and use a specific registration form provided by the federal government, which does not require such proof of citizenship. This is a hot topic right now. Arizona thus argued that this neglects Article 1, Section 2's right of states to manage congressional elections. The Supreme Court, though, where the majority opinion was based on historical evidence, ruled that Congress has the power to outline congressional elections, even if states set voting qualifications. It could have raised constitutional issues relating to the prevention of enforcement of voting qualifications by the state, but no doubts came to fruition. Although the Arizona matter was settled, it is in no way the end of discrepancy between Congress's ability to procedurally regulate congressional elections and state power to make voter qualifications. Many states actively disagree with the lack of federally required proof of citizenship to vote, and if new rules were to be implemented by Congress, questions would undoubtedly be brought to the court seeking resolution from varying points of view. The second implication of Article 1, Section 2 is in reference to redistricting and the drawing of district boundaries. Disagreements stated previously about the definitions of required population equality are at large. Both the Arizona and Texas cases relay the relevance of Article 1, Section 2 in the modern day, depending on their stance of constitutional interpretation. An even-eyed view of law and legal text should be observed in deciding upon voter rights propositions and controversies. Article 1, Section 3. The Senate of the United States shall be composed of 2 senators from each state, chosen by the legislature thereof, for 6 years, and each senator shall have 1 vote. Immediately after, they shall be assembled. In consequence of the first election, they shall be divided as equally as may be into 3 classes. The seats of the senators of the first class shall be vacated at the expiration of the second year, of the second class at the expiration of the fourth year, and of the third class at the expiration of the 6th year, so that 1/3 may be chosen every second year. And if vacancies happen by resignation or otherwise during the recess of the legislature of any state, the executive thereof may make temporary appointments until the next meeting of the legislature, which shall then fill such vacancies. No person shall be a senator who shall not have attained to the age of 30 years and been 9 years a citizen of the United States, and who shall not, when elected, be an inhabitant of that state for which he shall be chosen. The Vice President of the United States shall be President of the Senate, but shall have no vote unless they be equally divided. The Senate shall choose their officers, and also a President pro tempore, in the absence of the Vice President, or when he shall exercise the office of the President of the United States. The Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. When sitting for that purpose, they shall be on oath or affirmation. When the President of the United States is tried, the Chief Justice shall preside, and no person shall be convicted without the concurrence of 2/3 of the members present. Judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than to removal from office and to disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States, but the party convicted shall nevertheless be liable and subject to indictment, trial, judgment, punishment according to law. George Washington supposedly once told Thomas Jefferson, "We pour our legislation into the senatorial saucer to cool it." This metaphor encapsulates the hope of the framers in their establishment of the United States Senate via Article 1, Section 3. The Senate is established under Article 1, Section 3 of the Constitution, and like many other fixtures of the document, it was prescribed and formed to be anti-majoritarian. Popular majorities were likened to tyranny by the founding fathers. The Senate was therefore created in hopes of checking the House of Representatives and to direct democracy as a whole. In creating the Senate, it was originally so that senators would be elected differently from members of the House. Senators were elected by the state legislatures rather than by direct elections by the people, foregoing election by popular vote. The implication of this is that senators were originally held accountable by the states, and the recalling of them was commonplace. They were subject to strict direction by the state legislatures. Disregarding the size and population of a state, each state is awarded 2 senators. In this scenario, smaller states, such as the great state of Delaware, would have equal power in the Senate, even to a state such as New York. This is limited to the Senate, however, and does not extend to the House of Representatives. This is important so that each state is spared intimidation and oppression by other states, whether it be over sovereignty or federal controversy. The requirements and qualifications of United States senators are another testament to their design of being separated from the popular sway of majorities. To become a senator, one must be an age of at least 30 years old, and their term lengths are set at 6 years. The intention was to have more intelligent and better educated representatives in the Senate rather than the House, so that they were more prone to taking a longer stance or view on political issues. The disposition of taking a defensive stance in regard to protecting a Republican form of government is seen furthermore in the differing rules that distinguish chamber membership. The Constitution requires Senate approval for all legislation originating in the House of Representatives, except for powers outlined specifically in the Constitution. There are 4 critical responsibilities that the Senate must undertake as outlined in the Constitution. These include provisioning consent and advisory obligations toward presidential nominees, treaty ratification, misconduct-related convictions and removal of important government officials, and constitutional amendment approval. Some of these require a supermajority, which is a 2/3 majority vote, but approval of presidential nominees does not. James Madison described these duties as a shield to some particular interests and another obstacle generally to hasty and partial measures. It wasn't until 1913 that senators were finally elected by popular vote, largely and drastically changing senatorial procedure and its general development. The primary difference became that senators were no longer held directly accountable to state legislatures, and their so-called allegiance to their respective states was loosened. This somewhat sacrificed the sovereignty of states in some regard and promoted the popular will of the nation to a more federalized governmental system. As a result of this transformation, the governmental foundations of the United States have been all but eternally altered. The United States Senate is beyond important to the nation's constitutional structure. It is by far the most prominent upper chamber of all bicameral legislatures in the world. There's arguably a combination of executive, legislative, and judicial responsibilities designated to the Senate. Their far-reaching legislative power is derived simply from their co-equality with the House of Representatives. They are also able to override vetoes by the President with a supermajority and must provide consent for proposed legislation to become law. The Senate exercises executive power in their ratifying of treaties and their appointing of presidential nominees, many of whom are two federal agencies in the judicial branch of government. Another judicial responsibility vested in the Senate is its undertaking of impeachment trials against high-ranking officers of the nation, with a supermajority necessary for conviction and removal. James Madison argued that although the Senate combines the branches of government to constitute a form of tyranny, the ability of the checks and balances instituted in the Constitution is enough to combat this foregoing of separation of powers. He stated ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interests of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. Over time, Madison has been proven to be correct, although many other nations have degraded into democratic dictatorships when once having solid separation of powers. Historically, the separation of powers in the United States has prevented many Supreme Court and presidential abuses of power. Arguably, however, the Senate is the most powerful institution prescribed in the Constitution and has used these powers granted in the system of checks and balances. An oligarchy does come to light in the Senate and federal courts, where officials are chosen by the Senate, popular election of the presidency, and this way of political beliefs in the House of Representatives make way for the Senate and federal courts to be considered a bulkhead against such. This comes as a result of the long terms served by both federal court judges and senators. It is in contrast to the framers' attempt at creating a Republican form of government that such a powerful establishment exists. The reason for such a creation can be examined in light of admiration for philosophers of the past who have dictated that mixed regimes are superior to those of aristocracies, monarchies, and others. A mixed regime is deemed the most useful to human flourishing. Supposedly, the imagining and implementing of a Senate was purposed to combine the advantages and disadvantages of aristocracies, monarchies, and democracies into a mixed regime of the one, the few, and the many, therefore maximizing the results of each of the listed regime types. The framing of the Constitution would see the one president, the few in the Senate and Supreme Court, and the many in the House of Representatives. The resulting government would therefore not be constrained in foreign affairs, preserve fundamental rights, and be free in exercising power. The separation of powers still persists in the United States. Only legislative power is granted to this one, few, and many, unless specifically provided for by the Constitution. This is in alignment with the famous dictum, power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. The American federalist system witnesses the Senate as a balancing act besides its judicial, executive, and of course legislative functions. The fact of having two senators per state is a testament to the federal system in which states cannot substantially oppress one another. The senators' long terms will provide for continuity in the United States people's political belief system, and as a result of having arguably the loosest legislative debate procedures, the Senate is the only legislative body in the world not completely ruled by the majority. It can be seen that the United States Senate is more deliberative, aristocratic, and oligarchic than was originally intended by the Constitution, whether for better or for worse. Historically, the Senate of the United States has been frowned upon more than ever before. Great speeches by statesmen took place during the 19th century on the Senate floor, but this is rarely the case in modern times. Currently, people tend not to expect anything greater from the Senate than they do from the House of Representatives. There are many reasons for this demise of reputation that has taken place. One primary reason is the transference of being elected by the state legislature to a popular majority. Apparently, this broke many ties that senators had with the interests of their respective states, as stated previously. The Supreme Court has not recognized any difference in the Senate since its electoral change, but has cited other issues such as large conglomerations of congressional staffing, special interests and lobbying efforts, and the requirement of large funds to maintain their office-holding stature. There are also multiple amendments discussed later that have wrought the decay of the Senate, the majority of which, however, are in regard to the lack of state sovereignty. Another cause that has possibly given rise to corruption of the Senate is, as one New York columnist put it, public servants have become enmeshed in a system that drains them of their sense of vocation. His argument rests on the idea that many senators are simply career politicians and not serving the good will of the people of their own volition. This issue extends further than just the Senate, but it is rare for senators to be anything more than such. There were previously senators who also served in the State Department and those who have argued directly in the Supreme Court. Many people can blatantly see that both senators as well as the House of Representatives have fallen into a slump of sorts where they do nothing special for the common good. Record lows in productivity have fallen on the Senate while its terms have increased substantially. This has undoubtedly brought about an increase in partisan bickering as well. When approached with solutions, the Senate tends to produce obstacles. Final debate for nominations of private legislation has become hard-pressed. There is also no doubt that at one point the filibuster was a useful tool employed to reject majority rule on the Senate floor, but recently it has become a blatant example of the inability of the Senate to successfully implement its responsibilities and duties. One instance of proper use of the filibuster was in regard to civil rights. One major problem with the filibuster is the two-track system in which the simple mentioning of a filibuster can push legislation and nominations to the side. Filibusters have since increased in use ever since the two-track system was implemented. Senate filibusters have since been disallowed in the case of executive and judicial nominations, but unfortunately there are other possible mechanical procedures to prevent the same nominations. Approval and confirmation of judges in the lower courts has also become rare in comparison to previous generations. This and the late nominations of Supreme Court justices is all due to partisan controversy and rebuke. On top of all the issues resonating around the Senate, they have begun in the last couple of decades to have pro forma sessions in which they meet for rarely longer than a minute just to fulfill their obligation and therefore prevent recess appointments. C-SPAN is a great way to monitor and have access to the Senate, but even that has not dissuaded the Senate from using gimmicks and other tools to slow legislative-related business. We can see from C-SPAN that it is an extremely rare circumstance where a great debate takes place. Obstruction, in many cases, has not followed a noble calling. Regardless of the current standing of the Senate, it will most likely persist and in its current structure. Generally, the opportunity to enhance federal power despite state sovereignty has been pressed, and the Senate has done so, which is yet another pointedly aggrandized power of its establishment. The Senate is not the lone perpetrator in the degradation of state sovereignty. As the House of Representatives must and has followed suit, the Supreme Court has done its part in upholding such legislation as well. The only possibility for needed changes in the Senate is with cooperation amongst all branches of the United States government. Obstruction is made possible currently, but major changes to the status quo must incorporate more than just the legislative branch. Finally, it is extremely unfortunate that the Senate has degraded simply from a lack of conviction for a Republican form of government and their lack of wanting to serve the common good. Public debates have become naught for conveying mutual civility. At the very least, one positive notion regarding the Senate is that they no longer fight with actual weapons, and the issues of the Senate seem to revolve around partisan bickering. Article 1, Section 4 states the times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except at the places of choosing senators. The Congress shall assemble at least once in every year, and such meeting shall be on the first Monday in December, unless they shall by law appoint a different day. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution contains the Election Clause, which gives constitutional power to define elections for both the House of Representatives and the Senate. This clause gives direct authority to the states in determining times, places, and manner of elections for Congress members. This, however, is overseen by Congress's authority to make or alter these state regulations. These regulations include a complete code for such elections, including rules concerning public notices, voter registration, voter protection, fraud prevention, vote counting, and determination of election results. Although they do not explicitly have authority to enact such laws, when states do, they are operating under the Elections Clause. Congress decidedly has the supreme authority concerning elections, though states are primarily responsible. Federal laws regarding congressional elections may be made by Congress to preempt contradictory statutes by the states, and they can fill the gray area where states have lacked explicit rules. The Founding Fathers were distressed at the idea of states having the ability to inhibit the Constitution by restricting or dismissing elections for Congress. Congress is hence empowered to regulate these elections in self-defense. Congress has, in certain circumstances, used its power to alter congressional election rules, and some of these powers have translated into permanent changes to said elections. So far, it has established an election day and required congressional districts to be drawn for states with multi-representation. There are limits to financial support allowed to congressional candidates, as well as other financially related regulatory statutes. Also, voter registration forms must be made available, and accurate voter registration rolls must be kept. There are limitations on the power held by Congress in the states regarding congressional elections. For example, no law can be enacted that expressly lies in violation of other provisions in the Constitution. There are multiple amendments that have been implemented and enacted that protect a variety of voting rights for various portions of the general population, and burdens on voter registration have been prohibited on multiple occasions. If a law requires qualifications for voting, it is at the discretion of the court system to determine whether such regulations are constitutional. Some of the laws permitted, however, by the Elections Clause include those requiring people to register to vote in advance of elections or mandating that they vote at their assigned polling places. Although the Constitution outlines provisions that require specific qualifications for Congresspeople to meet in order to be elected, states have the power to impose more restrictions. They are substantially less severe, but include reasonable ballot access restrictions. There are limits to this imposed by the Supreme Court, such as if a candidate for the House of Representatives has served for at least 3 terms or a senator 2 terms. The Supreme Court has ruled on limitations on Congress's imposition of congressional election oversight. Both states and Congress are prohibited from determining the result of an election, as well as from favoring specific groups of candidates. One important note to make regarding congressional elections is that the Elections Clause does not designate power to states themselves, but rather the legislatures thereof. In regard to the electoral process, however, the Supreme Court has distinguished the term legislature in a broad view that allows for groups or procedural processes that are prescribed lawmaking authority by the state's constitution to be included. Therefore, certain procedures undertaken by the state's populace have the power to regulate the electoral process for representatives and senators. And as previously discussed, the Supreme Court has upheld that state legislatures may delegate power to other entities or officials. In some states, this has even been a practice for redistricting, but it also relates to independent bodies monitoring and modifying the electoral process. Summarily, there is a complex process on both the state and federal levels in determining the electoral process. Arguably, the ability to regulate elections is the most important component of the Constitution. It is possible to severely alter the outcome of elections based on principles instituted by legislatures. The framers of the Constitution decisively gave the power to regulate the electoral process to the legislative branch in the hope that it would ensure fairness and proper representation of the will of the people. The recent Supreme Court, in stark contrast, decidedly disagrees and instead would see the state legislatures as admittedly trying to hold influence over congressional election outcomes. This can be seen in the states as well as Congress, where partisan help has been extended to same party candidates seeking election. Again, the Supreme Court has held a loose meaning of legislature and allowed for the delegation of power. Although their intentions may have been positive, the term has been and is used repeatedly in the Constitution to recognize the institution of primary lawmaking authority to be that of the legislature. Thence, the misguided use of the term has led to explicit disregard of the Elections Clause, and results-oriented jurisprudence has been implemented. There is not much advantage to allowing for independent commissions to redistrict and regulate the electoral process over that of state legislatures. This would most likely be a result of partisan views simplistically being hidden by independent commissions, whereas state legislatures are in plain view. Concurrent jurisdiction is extended to both Congress and the state legislatures simultaneously. Congress used its ability to create or modify electoral procedures rarely until the mid-1800s, and the state legislatures were largely left to regulate elections. However, since then, the Elections Clause has been the primary subject of legislation to impose federal regulations on the state's monitoring of elections. Regardless, Congress still seems to assume that the right to regulate the electoral process is largely the responsibility of the states. The Elections Clause has been considered by the Supreme Court to be one of a kind in its ensuing cooperation and congruent utility between Congress and the states. In further articles of the Constitution, this cooperation is extended and elaborated upon further to prevent overextending of their political sway. The Constitution expressly gives Congress the overreaching power in regulating elections. Congress has veto powers when it comes to state regulation of elections. States can regulate elections only as far as Congress allows. Besides this, however, states are responsible for the timing, in what manner, and the location of elections, and therefore have a large role to play. The state implementation of elections is a default practice, and the Supreme Court's loose definition of legislature allows for more flexibility.